From behind the glass of a museum case, it seems to stare right through you. A life-size skull, carved from flawless quartz, said to hold the secrets of a lost civilization. In 1924, deep in the jungles of Belize, 17-year-old Anna Mitchell Hedges spotted a glint of light among the ruins of a forgotten Mayan city. There it was, a crystal skull, perfect and mesmerizing. For decades it was called the Skull of Doom, said to grant visions, heal, or even kill. But beneath the legend lies a far stranger truth. This isn't ancient magic, it's one of history's most elaborate archaeological hoaxes. The story of the crystal skull is a tale of mystery, obsession, and our unshakable desire to believe in the impossible. The legend of the Skull of Doom. The tale of the Mitchell Hedges skull is the foundation of the entire crystal skull mythology. It's the perfect origin story, dripping with the romance of early 20th century exploration. You've got a swashbuckling adventurer, F.A. Mitchell Hedges, a man who basically cultivated a real-life Indiana Jones persona, and his daughter making a discovery worthy of a movie screen. The story grabbed the public's imagination and turned a curious object into a legendary artifact. According to Anna, the local Maya working on the dig were terrified of the skull. They supposedly fell to the ground before it, recognizing it as an object of immense power used by their ancestors' high priests. F.A. Mitchell Hedges himself leaned into this, writing in his autobiography, Danger, My Ally, that the skull was at least 3,600 years old and was the embodiment of all evil. He claimed priests used it to will their enemies to death, and just like that, the Skull of Doom was born. But its alleged powers weren't all bad. After her father died, Anna became the skull's keeper and chief promoter. She took it on tour, charging people to see it and listen to its incredible story. Over the decades, the list of its supposed supernatural abilities just kept growing. People reported seeing visions in its depths, images of ancient temples, strange rituals, even other worlds. Others felt a strange energy radiating from it, a force that could bring either intense peace or profound dread. The legend grew wilder. The skull could change color, emit sounds, and project holograms. It was a psychic amplifier, a crystal computer that held the entire history of humanity. Anna insisted it was carved from a single block of quartz with a perfection that modern tools couldn't replicate. She even claimed that experts at Hewlett-Packard examined it in the 1970s and were completely baffled. They supposedly concluded it was carved against the natural axis of the crystal, a feat that should have shattered it. They estimated, she said, that it must have taken generations of Mayan artisans over 300 years, slowly rubbing it with sand and water to create it. This story was almost too good to be true, and that's because it was. Official records show F.A. Mitchell Hedges never even mentioned the skull until 1943, almost 20 years after he supposedly found it. And he didn't find it in a Mayan temple. He bought it. Auction records from the prestigious London auction house Sotheby's show that on October 15, 1943, Frederick Mitchell Hedges purchased a quartz crystal skull for $400 from a London art dealer named Sidney Burney. When confronted with this years later, Anna changed her story, claiming her father had just left the skull with Burney as collateral. But the dealer's own records suggest he got it from someone else entirely. The dramatic discovery in the jungle was a total fabrication, cooked up years later to give the object a mysterious and valuable backstory. Even the Hewlett-Packard story was a massive exaggeration. The lab did look at the skull, but they simply confirmed it was made of a single piece of quartz and noted its impressive craftsmanship. They offered no opinions on its age or paranormal powers. The Skull of Doom wasn't an ancient Mayan relic. It was a remarkable carving with a brilliant but completely fictional story. And as it turned out, it wasn't the only one. A global phenomenon and the first doubts Long before Mitchell Hedges bought his Skull of Doom, other crystal skulls were already sitting in the world's top museums. The British Museum got its skull back in 1897. The Musée de l'Homme in Paris had two. Another would later show up at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. For most of the 20th century, they were displayed as genuine pre-Columbian artifacts, usually labeled Aztec or Mixtec. Their presence in these celebrated institutions gave a huge boost to the idea that ancient Mesoamericans really did make these things. The appearance of these skulls can largely be traced back to one man, a French antiquities dealer named Eugène Bobin. Bobin was your classic 19th century adventurer archaeologist. He spent years in Mexico, even becoming the official archaeologist for the Mexican Emperor Maximilian. He built a reputation as a top expert in pre-Columbian artifacts and started selling off his massive collection from his shop in Paris. His timing was perfect. Late 19th century Europe was obsessed with ancient and exotic cultures. Museums and rich collectors were in a frenzy to buy artifacts, creating a red-hot market. But that demand also fueled a thriving trade in fakes. As early as 1886, a Smithsonian archaeologist warned that spurious Mexican antiquities were flooding the market. Curators often didn't have the expertise to tell the real from the fake, so they had to trust dealers like Bobin. And Bobin delivered. The skull that now sits in the British Museum first appeared in his Paris shop. He actually tried to sell it to Mexico's National Museum first, but the curator suspected it was a modern fake and passed. Undeterred, Bobin took his business to New York. The skull was eventually sold to Tiffany & Co., the famous jeweler, who then sold it to the British Museum in 1897, giving it the stamp of authenticity. The two skulls in the Paris Museum. They came from Bobin too. For decades, the skulls sat in their cases, objects of wonder. But scholars and archaeologists were starting to have serious doubts. The first big red flag was the complete lack of archaeological context. Not a single crystal skull has ever been found in a documented scientific dig of a Mayan, Aztec, or any other pre-Columbian site. They just sort of appear on the art market, always with a wild and unprovable story attached, just like the one Anna Mitchell Hedges would later invent. The second problem was the style. Skulls were a common theme in Mesoamerican art, but the crystal skulls looked nothing like the authentic versions. Real Aztec or Mayan skulls are highly stylized, often grotesque or covered in patterns. The crystal skulls, on the other hand, are starkly realistic and anatomically precise in a way that just doesn't fit any known pre-Columbian art style. Then there was the material. Mesoamerican artisans were masters of carving hard materials like jade, but the kind of large, flawless quartz crystal needed to make these skulls wasn't really available to them. The more scholars looked, the more these skulls stood out from everything they knew. The questions piled up. If these skulls were so important, why aren't they mentioned in any Mayan or Aztec writings? Why do they look so different from every other artifact? And how did they all seem to trace back to a single French dealer in the late 19th century? The legend was great, but the evidence was pointing somewhere else entirely. It was time to move the skulls from the display case to the science lab. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's greatest archaeological mysteries, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next, when science gets its hands on the skulls and finally reveals the truth. Under the microscope, the scientific reveal. For years, the debate over the crystal skulls was all about artistic style and shady historical records. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the argument moved from the art history department to the science lab. The skulls were about to face a level of scrutiny their makers could never have dreamed of. The investigation was led by two major institutions that both owned a famous skull, the British Museum and the Smithsonian. Researchers like Margaret Sachs at the British Museum and anthropologist Jane McLaren Walsh at the Smithsonian, an expert in spotting fakes, were on the case. Walsh got especially interested in 1992 when the Smithsonian received an anonymous gift, a massive, milky white crystal skull, even bigger than the Mitchell Hedges one. The note claimed it was Aztec, bought in Mexico in 1960. The scientists used a whole suite of modern tech, but the most important tool was the scanning electron microscope, or SEM. An SEM can zoom in on the surface of an object hundreds of thousands of times, revealing details totally invisible to the naked eye. They were looking for one thing: tool marks. Every act of carving or polishing leaves microscopic signatures, and those signatures are a direct fingerprint of the tools used to make them. Ancient Mesoamerican artisans would have used a painstaking process of abrasion, slowly grinding the hard quartz down with things like sand and water. This manual process would leave a chaotic pattern of tiny, irregular scratches. But when the scientists put the British Museum and Smithsonian skulls under their electron microscopes, they found something completely different. Instead of messy, hand-abraded marks, the surfaces were covered in perfectly straight, parallel grooves. These were the unmistakable tracks of a modern, high-speed rotary tool, something that simply did not exist in the ancient Americas. To make matters worse, they found that the abrasive used to polish the skulls was a substance like diamond or corundum, industrial-grade materials only used for this kind of work in the modern era. On the Smithsonian skull, Walsh even found traces of silicon carbide, a man-made abrasive that wasn't even invented until the late 1800s. The evidence was undeniable. These skulls could not have been made by the ancient Maya or Aztecs. They were carved with 19th century European jewelers' tools. The same was later found on the Paris skull, and when Jane Walsh finally got to examine the most famous skull of all, the Mitchell Hedges skull, she found the exact same thing, the telltale marks of modern rotary tools. The story about it being hand-polished for 300 years was a complete myth. But they didn't stop there. They also analyzed the quartz itself. By studying microscopic mineral flecks inside the crystal, they could trace the stone back to its geological source. The quartz in the British Museum skull, for example, contained tiny green specks of a mineral that doesn't come from Mexico. Its geological signature points to Brazil or Madagascar. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The tool marks pointed to the 19th century, the quartz came from Brazil, and the history pointed to Eugène Boban. The trail led directly to a town in Germany renowned for exactly this kind of work, Idar Oberstein. For centuries, Idar Oberstein has been a world-famous center for gemstone carving. In the late 19th century, its artisans were importing huge amounts of high-quality quartz from Brazil to meet European demand. It's now almost certain that the British Museum and Paris skulls were carved in these German workshops, sold to the dealer Eugène Boban, who then invented a dramatic backstory and sold them as priceless ancient artifacts to a market hungry for mystery. The Mitchell Hedges skull is thought to be a slightly later creation, likely carved in Europe as a more detailed copy of the now famous British Museum skull. The mystery was solved. The whispers of ancient magic had been silenced by cold, hard data. The skulls weren't relics from a lost temple. They were products of a 19th century German workshop. The question was no longer what they were, but why the hoax had worked so well and why even now, the legend refuses to die. The birth of a modern myth. The science is clear. The famous crystal skulls are modern fakes. But that just opens up a more interesting question. Why did this hoax take hold so powerfully? And why do people still believe in their mystical powers? The answer tells us a lot about the time they were made in, and even more about ourselves. The original hoax, pulled off by dealers like Eugène Boban, was a product of its time. The Victorian era was an age of exploration and colonialism, with an almost obsessive interest in antiquities. Museums and wealthy collectors were in a mad dash to fill their cabinets with treasures from around the world. This created a mania for pre-Columbian artifacts. Where there's high demand and limited supply, forgeries are sure to follow. The most sophisticated fakes came not from Mexico, but from Europe. The master craftsmen of Idar Oberstein, Germany, were simply meeting a commercial demand. They had the skills and the imported Brazilian quartz. Boban wasn't just a dealer, he was a marketing genius. He knew an object's value was in its story. By inventing an ancient origin for these skulls, he turned beautifully carved objects into priceless relics. He wasn't just selling a skull, he was selling a legend, and the museums, desperate for unique Aztec artifacts, bought it. For decades, the skulls were mostly just museum oddities, but the legend got a massive reboot in the mid-20th century thanks to the story spun by Anna Mitchell Hedges. Her tale of finding the Skull of Doom in a jungle temple was a media sensation. But the myth truly exploded in the 1970s and 80s with the rise of the New Age movement. This new spiritual movement was fascinated with ancient wisdom, psychic energy, crystals, and lost civilizations like Atlantis. The crystal skulls were a perfect fit. New Age authors detached the skulls from their supposed Aztec roots and reimagined them as cosmic tools. They were no longer just ritual objects. They were psychic computers left by aliens, gateways to other dimensions, or focusing lenses for Earth's energy. It was during this time that the legend of the 13 skulls was born. The idea of 12 skulls for 12 worlds, with a 13th to unite them, has absolutely no basis in any real Mayan, Aztec, or any other Native American mythology. It's a purely modern invention, a piece of 20th century folklore that was so catchy it started being repeated as ancient truth. This new mythology was then supercharged by pop culture. The biggest example, of course, is the 2008 movie Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which introduced the legend to a massive global audience. Even though it was fiction, the film cemented the image of the skulls as objects of paranormal and extraterrestrial power in the public mind. Even today, with proof that the skulls are modern, their allure is as strong as ever. They are still reliable crowd pleasers in museums. New skulls are still being carved and sold with the same mystical claims. The story of the crystal skulls reveals something profound about us. We are often more captivated by a good story than by cold, hard facts. The idea of a magical Mayan artifact is just more exciting than a 19th century German art object. The skulls are proof of our collective desire to believe there is still magic in the world, and that some mysteries are beyond what science can explain. If you found this investigation fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into historical mysteries, and be sure to share this video with anyone who loves a good story. Thanks for watching.